This is why I want to be an interpreter. I don't have to deal with the technological part. So, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Samantha, for that brilliant first presentation. So, my presentation focused on a children's novel. This is called, my presentation is called The Complex Simplicity of Elephants, Mirrors, Sun Eaters, and the Translation Challenges that I found in Elsa Bornemann, who is the author, in her short stories. So this is the author, Elsa Bornemann. She's born in Argentina and is actually one of the most decorated literary children's book authors that has ever decided to write. She has a number of honors, as you can see. She's not only written children's books, but poetry, short story, songs, even plays, television. She's even done translations. So it was very interesting translating some of her short stories, because one of the things that I found was that her short stories have been translated already into a number of languages. So they are, in that sense, translatable stories. They've even been translated into Braille. So she has a very interesting aspect to her books. So this is the book where I took the short stories. It's called Un elefante ocupa mucho espacio. This is perhaps one of her most famous books because during the national reorganization process, or the last military junta in Argentina, in the late 70s and 80s, this book was banned and censored. So it wasn't allowed to be read, published, sold anywhere in Argentina. This is a quote translated from the Argentine government as the reason. And it says, the stories were aimed at children with an aim of indoctrination that is preparatory to the task of the ideological attraction to subversive activities. So basically her book was meant to make children be rebellious, to incite anti-establishment claims in the minds of young readers. Now, after researching this, it was determined, Elsa Bornemann herself stated that that was never the intent of her book. She actually had written this book before all of this happened, and in many of her books, there are themes of doing the right thing, of standing up for one's rights, one's liberties, but it's very interesting that a children's book would actually be banned, seen as such a threat to an entire government of one of the largest countries in South America. So the main theory that I based my actual translations on was the Skybos theory by Hans Bergmann, who was a German linguist. And Skybos theory is, as you can see, it's translation, the idea that translation should primarily take into account the function of the source and the target text. And it focuses on translation as an activity with an aim or purpose and on the intended addressee or the audience of the translation. This is very important with respect to my actual translations, because the purpose of this book was never, according to the author at least, never to incite public rebellion. It was, in fact, it has a very simple purpose of entertaining young readers. It's a children's book. It's supposed to teach lessons. It's supposed to make one's imagination run wild. And so Paul Kussmaul, who was also a German linguist, had this very interesting quote to say about this theory. It says, the function of a translation is dependent on the knowledge, expectations, values, and norms of the target readers, who are again influenced by the situation they are in and by the culture. These factors determine whether the function of the source text or passages in the source text can be preserved or have to be modified or even changed. And this basically was a guiding theory that I used to determine whether I would stick to a more literal translation of her stories or try and adapt them culturally if that was needed. Basically because the purpose of her stories is to entertain young readers, to elicit a certain, to maybe stimulate their imaginations. That was my overall goal. So, a basic rundown of what I had to keep in mind with every short story was the function of the book was to entertain. My goal, my personal goal as a translator, was to elicit the same image in the imagination of the target text readers as produced in the minds of the source text readers. So this obviously meant that I had to consult a number of native Spanish speakers who actually read her books to actually have an idea of what they imagined when reading her novels. And fidelity to the source text, or how literal or free I should make my translations, I decided, and it turned out quite well, I think, to maintain a very high level of fidelity. A more literal translation was used as long as the goal of eliciting the same type of imagination or eliciting the same images in the target text readers wasn't compromised. So to give you a general idea of how much the image and the fidelity and the purpose of these novels or these stories actually coincide, we're going to talk about the diminutive dilemma. In Spanish, the diminutive suffixes like ito and ita, played a big part in these short stories. So these are the three stories that I translated, and as you can see, one example from each. These are just a few of various that appeared in the noun. So there are a number of reasons that one would employ a diminutive suffix in Spanish to indicate something small, as you can see, to indicate something that's charming or endearing. But the initial translations, if you eliminated the diminutive suffix, as you can see, ito, oita, bear old woman belly up, completely different from the final translation and the image that you get when you actually read. A bear is very different from a bear cub. When I think of a bear, I think of something that would probably take my life. When I think of a bear cub, think of something I could have as a pet. It's a whole other image. Just like an old woman and a little old lady. An old woman, I mean, that could go a number of ways. She could be a mean old woman, she could be a witch, she could be your grandmother. But a little old lady is something that's endearing. It's a whole other image of what you actually get when you read. Belly up and tummy up was more ambiguous, but tummy up is something you would expect to hear from a child. I'm talking about their tummy, not necessarily their stomach or their belly, a more formal term. So I thought this basically was a good example of why I had to keep in use the Skypo's theory in general, why the purpose to function and fidelity was so important. So I guess you're all wondering why elephants, mirrors, and sun eaters. They basically pertain to the three stories that I translated. Un elefante ocupa mucho espacio, which I translated as an elephant takes up a lot of space, which is also the title of the book itself. Cuando fallan los espejos, when the mirrors malfunction, and donde se cuentan las fechorías del comensal, the tale of the sun eater's crimes. And so we're going to see one example of a translation challenge that I had in each story, which will also basically give you the same idea that the chart of the general translation problems gave. So the first one, un elefante ocupa mucho espacio. There's a quote in the story, a line that says, you all can read this in the translation in English or in Spanish, but this part here, translating elephant as a state of mind or as a language. I'll read the English for you. It says, but that Victor circus elephant even decided to think in elephant, that is to have an idea as enormous as his body. That's something that some don't know, and that's why I'm telling you. So the interesting thing, and I guess a different translator would have gone a different way with this, but when I spoke to Professor Burgos, who was my director with this, he actually suggested I actually initially translated it as a state of mind, because in elephant, as you can see here, in elefante, I thought it was maybe him deciding to think as elephants think. I don't know how elephants think, but I assumed that was correct to the story. But Professor Burgos suggested the idea that maybe he was thinking as a language, and that I should pay attention to the grammar. Why? In Spanish grammar, names of languages aren't capitalized. So this actually becomes quite ambiguous. But if you translate it in English, if you put in elephant, taking it as a language, which means it would have to be capitalized, it's a whole nother idea that Victor, in his mind, wasn't thinking as an elephant, which matches with the story, because Victor is actually thinking more as an independent, free being who decides to help his friends free themselves from the circus. That's basically the overall story. And he's thinking in his mind, in his language, but not necessarily as a normal circus elephant who would just be a prisoner within the circus. So that was one very interesting translation aspect that came about simply by looking at the grammar of the story. This was by far my favorite translation challenge, and it seems quite simple, but this was actually the most enjoyable. An overall gist of the story, this story, as you can see from the picture, is about a little girl who goes to visit her uncle. The uncle has two mirrors, but he says the mirrors malfunction. Now, a mirror doesn't really malfunction, it's either broken or it's not broken. You can see your reflection or you can't. So why would the author say, literally in Spanish, it's los espejos están descompuestos? So it's interesting because the analogy that the mirrors have in the story is to a watch. They malfunction because, as you can see, the little girl in one mirror is a mirror that's slow, as a watch would be slow if it's broken. It shows the past, as she was as a young girl. And her old uncle sees himself as a young man. The other mirror is fast, basically showing the future. But the book never references the mirror's problem or its malfunction as time. So there's no direct statement that it's malfunctioning like a watch. It's simply that one mirror is slow and one mirror is fast. So reading through the story, it was actually hard to figure out what she was trying to say until you look at it and you think, well, the only way this could actually work is if it was a watch. So if you think of the mirrors as a watch, it makes perfect sense why one would be slow and why one would be fast. And this analogy goes through, it's completely essential to the entire story. If you miss this one thing, you miss the entire purpose of the story, which is basically showing the little girl's excitement of seeing herself as a little old lady in the mirror that's fast, or the baby once again in the mirror that's slow. This was by far my favorite story to just read. I'm not much of a reader, especially since I came to grad school and I have to read a lot. But I do like reading, especially in Spanish, especially children's novels. So, Donde se cuentan las fechorías de Comisol, the tale of the Sun Eater's crimes. This story revolves around a young cat who basically spends his entire day sunbathing, just sitting in the sun, like a fat cat like Garfield, just taking in the sun. And he basically decides to build a machine that captures the sunlight. He tries to sell the sunlight to the other cats who live with him, and it eventually causes a revolt. The interesting thing is this quote. This is the actual first line of the entire story, so it sets the tone for everything. They called him the Sun Eater. Why? Because he seemed to feed on raw sunlight, making a reference to the fact that he simply sat in the sun, just taking in rays of sun all day. Now, how the hobby of sunbathing became the metaphor for the crime of sun hoarding, it is because in the story, as you can see, his name, Come Sol, is basically a combination of two words in Spanish, comer, which is to eat, and sol, which is sun. So the Sun Eater is where it comes from. They called him that because he was sunbathing. The machine that he creates to actually absorb the sunlight, take the sunlight, is called the acarpasol, which comes from two Spanish words as well, acarpar, which is literally to hoard, or to gather something, and sol, of course, which is sun. So, I, in my translation, called it the sun hoarder. And it's interesting that sunbathing, sun hoarding, and sun eating basically compose the entire, it is basically the essence of the story. His name, what he does innocently, and his name also corresponds to the crime, his uninnocent act of actually stealing the sun. When he was taking the sun for himself, sunbathing, he was fine. He wasn't taking anything that belonged to everyone. When he built his machine, his sun hoarder, to take the sun from everyone, it became a crime. And so that's where we get the title. And it was interesting, I actually translated the title after I translated the entire story, The Tale of the Sun Eater's Crimes. So in conclusion, I thought this was a very quote from Enrique Diaz Canedo, who was a Spanish translator, also a Spanish poet. He says, translating is always sacrificing, but not sacrificing anything essential. And I think that basically sums up what I've learned, at least in the program, is that, as Samantha said, that as Nita said, there's always some type of equivalence you can find. And maybe something's lost, maybe something's gained. But the image that you can instill in the reader, the actual imagination that you can stimulate, the actual translation itself for the target text readers, doesn't have to necessarily differ from the image or the imagination of the source text readers. The words may change, but the message stays the same. Thank you.
So this was really interesting, and they sound like delightful stories. You've sort of taken on a double translation if you talk about your cultural translation, because not only are you going Spanish to English, but you're translating children's stories. Did you give thought to kind of what age group would be involved in the original audience and then in your target audience of your translation?
I did. When I first initially started translating these stories, I had in mind that they were for very small children, because our most famous books are directed towards the more children who are beginning to read age group. And I assumed it was the same for this book. But actually reading the stories and seeing the terminology and the way things were phrased, it's actually probably more focused to those in elementary school, but those who have already learned to read. So I took that into account because things on words like malfunction, I don't think when I was 5 I ever used the word malfunction at all. But I think that played a big part into it because I did have more liberty with respect to the vocabulary that I used in my translations, not trying to simplify it so much that it would be understandable for very young readers, but not as complicated that it would clearly not be directed towards children.
What made you choose these children's novels?
I actually was given a book by her most favorite book, The Last Wizard of a Word I can't pronounce. It's a very long word. But that was probably her most favorite book, and I read it, when I was first learning Spanish. So I looked up her novels, and I liked the book. But these 3 stories presented the most interesting translation challenges. I read all 15, but these 3 stories presented challenges that, I would have never expected to come across as a translator at all. So that was mainly, it's pure interest at the end of the day.
It's really interesting.
Are you going to send this translation to her? Are you going to publish it? How does it work?
Yeah, that publishing, I'm still looking into that. My second reader seemed to like my story, so we'll see where that goes. But it was very interesting. Elsa Boorman actually died a little less than a year ago. She died May 24th of last year. So it would have been, if we had started this project maybe last May, it would have been just very interesting to actually email her and see what she thought of the translation, since she's had so many of her works translated to other works. But it's one of those things where it's, you just try and maintain the spirit now that, the physical part's gone.
Yeah.
So if you want to publish, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Those stores are publishable, and there's a really rich market, and especially the kind of writers and that time. So I think you should start thinking about it.
You have to approach publishers. You
Yeah.
have to find the publisher.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But he can start publishing magazines.
Yeah.
There are plenty of there.
That'd be wonderful.
I can help you with that, and also there are publishers.
Are you my second reader?
Yeah.
Mystery solved.
Mystery solved.
Let me know if you want an illustrator.
Okay.
I was admiring the illustration that you had on your PowerPoint.
Oh, that's from the book.
What is from the book?
No, I didn't do that.
I wondered how you got
that.
that. Any other questions? Thank you.
Yes,